Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second session of the day for Experience 2021. I'm happy to welcome you to this session called How to Maintain Excellent Test Coverage. We have with us today a couple of fantastic presenters. Before we jump into that, though, I'm going to cover a couple of housekeeping items. So we'll do a 30-minute session. We'll save some room at the end for questions and answers. If you have any questions throughout today's event, feel free to submit those through the question tab on the event platform. I'll take a look at those and share those with our presenters as we get closer to the end of our scheduled time. If you have any other issues that come up throughout the session today, feel free to drop those into the chat as well. As a reminder, we are recording, so all the sessions today and tomorrow will be recorded and available afterward, and we'll share those around for everybody who attends and even everybody who registers. So jumping over to our next slide here, a little introduction of today's presenters. So I'm really pleased that we have a guest presenter from a company called Sensomatic, Adeeb Valiulla, sorry. I knew I was going to make that not do that right, but anyway, so Adeeb comes to the session today with a ton of experience in quality assurance, most recently at Sensomatic, and he's going to talk a little bit about how they handle test coverage, some of the metrics that they look at, and some of the success that they've had so far. We also have Geoff Cooney here today. He's our engineering manager at Enable. He's been with the company for 4.5 years, which is pretty amazing because the company is about 4.5 years old. But has also, again, has tons of experience in development and engineering for tech companies and software in particular. So for today's agenda, we're going to cover a couple of different topics. We're going to talk a little bit, Geoff and Adeeb are going to talk a little bit about why you should care about excellent test coverage, what that means. How do we at Mable think about test coverage for our own engineering efforts? Geoff has firsthand knowledge of how we handle things here for our own testing our own application. How does Sensomatic in particular, and Adeeb will talk about this, how do they approach test coverage, examples of how that test coverage impacts the business and creates better quality software for their customers and users. And then last but not least, a bit of advice for you all today on how to improve test coverage for your own organization. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Geoff. Geoff, take it away.
Thank you, Katie. I thought I'd start just by sharing some numbers from our 2020, the Mable's 2021 testing and DevOps report that highlight the importance of testing and code coverage on both teams and customer outcomes. Some of those of you who attended the keynote speech, some of these numbers may be a little familiar. So to start with, we surveyed a number of teams and engineers and practitioners about about how their teams operated, what test coverage they had. And you'll see from this data here that of all the teams that's self-described as fully DevOps and automated, only 4% of them describe themselves as having insufficient test coverage. And of those teams that are fully DevOps and automated, 23% describe themselves as having excellent test coverage, as compared to 4 to 7% for all the other categories. I think this really highlights the how critical having effective test coverage is to being able to get fully automated in DevOps and be able to push things out with reliability and with reliability and confidence. At the same time, we see high test coverage makes our teams more efficient. Teams that had excellent test coverage reported a good or seamless transition of handoff of issues to engineering. Nearly 80% of those teams reported that. And we also see that our time that teams' times to resolve issues is significantly faster. As you can see, teams with excellent test coverage had nearly twice reported that they could release fixes to production in under 8 hours for bugs, in nearly twice as often as all other levels of test coverage. So that just kind of shows that good test coverage is critical to making our teams perform well, keeping up speed, getting the DevOps. But what about the customer outcomes? So at the same time, we see of teams that reported having high test coverage, 80% of them 80% of them reported high customer happiness, with only 3% of those same teams reporting low customer happiness. Compare that to teams that said they had low coverage, which were nearly a 50-50 split, with 30% of those teams reporting high happiness. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about how Mabel thinks about driving towards effective test coverage. Presumably we're all here because we believe that test coverage and testing is a critical part of the software development lifecycle. But how do we get to effective test coverage? And I want to highlight a few things that we think about here in the Mabel engineering team, and also kind of ground that in some examples of what we do internally in these different areas. The one thing I did want to highlight is when we talk about test coverage in this sense, if you Google test coverage, you'll often find information about the metrics, right? How do we measure what's the line percent coverage, what's the branch coverage? When we talk about test coverage, and when we think about test coverage, we're really thinking about how do we ensure that we're testing our application in such a way that it behaves as we expect and that users get the experience they expect, which is a slightly broader definition than just the measurements. Measurements are a piece of that, but not the whole thing. So the first thing we think about at Mabel when we think about that is how do we make it easy? How do we make it dead simple for people to add additional test coverage, for people to contribute to our testing story and to make our app better tested? And maybe an example there of one of the examples I like to think about there is, imagine we have a developer who's working on a bug fix, takes them, say, it's a relatively simple bug fix, takes them an hour to find the solution. Maybe it's just a couple lines, 10 minutes to get the change in. And then now they'd like to add some test coverage to make sure that doesn't happen again. If it's 15 minutes for them to add some new tests, they're definitely going to do it. If it's an hour, probably. You start looking at, if it takes a day because the right pieces and infrastructure isn't there and they have to set up mocks and infrastructure, or they have to define, if they're working in Mabel, they have to define all the reusable blocks from scratch. Then they're much less likely to actually do that. And you're also starting to push at, getting outside that 8-hour window, delivering the fix. Now you're trading off, do I want to deliver the fix quickly, or do I want to make sure I have it tested so it doesn't occur again? So maybe we think about this in two dimensions, right? One is, how do we make it dead simple, easy to add new test coverage? And at the same time, how do we make it easy for developers to get feedback and act on that test coverage? You saw Dan touch on both these dimensions a little bit in the keynote speech. In terms of making it easy to add tests, a lot of this is about the infrastructure and simplicity of the process, right? So if you're talking about unit tests, some examples of what Mabel does there is we have a unit test infrastructure that makes it easy for us to add and test simple HTML files. This allows us to validate that our test execution systems are running as expected, and that if we add some new feature or functionality there, it's relatively easy to add a quick example case and load that up and test it. Similarly, when you're talking about API or other layers, you want to have mock services. And then when you get up to the end-to-end test level, you're looking at Mabel building blocks in Mabel. How do we have flows that can be reused in different tests? One example of this for Mabel is when we find that we highly parallelize our test executions, the login flow, we actually have some risk of getting blocked by our vendor because we have too many tests logging in at the same time with the same user. And so we have a reusable flow we built that handles this case and makes it easy for not every engineer who builds every engineer or product owner who builds a new Mabel test has to rethink through that logic. At the same time, running lots of tests is great, but we need to be able to get that feedback to developers to act on it as quick as possible. So part of what we think about, some of the things we're doing there from a Mabel perspective is we have some infrastructure that basically automatically generates test environments for each pull request. You can see that in the image to the right. So when the pull request goes up, we automatically create a new environment, link to it there. And then we also do CI/CD integration. For us, that's GitHub Actions. You can see some of the actions we run on the right as well. And so that's in those GitHub Actions, they run code checks, they run unit tests, and then they also run our Mabel tests. And that sort of dynamically spun up environment is critical to that because we're able to automatically kick off both headless tests and tests in the cloud that run against that environment and give us real-time feedback on the end-to-end that do end-to-end validation of our changes before we push them out. And then we also have a set of tests that don't necessarily run a PR, but do regular monitoring of our environments to ensure that they're healthy, that the application is behaving as expected. And those actually pipe onto our on-call rotation and page people to take a look at them if they start failing and make sure that there's no problem with the application. now that we have, so now that we kind of have this infrastructure that allows us to add tests without too much difficulty, the next question is, how do we make sure how do we focus our efforts? The next thing we think about is how do we focus our efforts to ensure we're to know where we don't have test coverage or where we are testing, or if this new feature, what are the things we do or don't have. And so at Mabel, that we have a number of tools we use for that, right? So we use Jest, unit test, and branch line coverage, which tells us which specific code paths are tested and which aren't. For Mabel, we actually use the Mabel and Mabel coverage metrics, which also could kind of tell us which sections of the application are tested and which tests have we run most recently on the last release, and do we have gaps of things that should be scheduled to run in our plan, but they're not in the right plan. And that also layers in some non-functional information, such as Dan demonstrated before. Do we have pages that have gotten less performant or tests that have gotten less performant? Is that something we need to dig in on? Then at the same time, we also want to know, it's nice to know which paths we're testing, which paths we aren't testing, but there's also the question of what is the quality of those tests that we're creating? What is the quality of our testing against those paths? And for that, we use a lot of sort of code review and manual feedback on our Mabel test cases. So things we're looking for there: do we have the right things covered that we thought would be covered? Do we have the right test cases? And do we have enough assertions? Is it, it's good to test the paths, but you also want to verify that you also want to have verification that the page looks like what it should, that various elements look like what they should. And finally, the final thing one of the other things we kind of think about is continual feedback. How do we, as we saw earlier, right? The goal of testing is not just to, one of the goals of testing is to simplify the engineering process, but another goal is to make sure that users are getting the experience that they expect. And sometimes that means more than just what the team initially sets up for test coverage, right? So what we do is we take, now that we have this coverage in place, that allows us to go to the next level of sort of quality engineering. And we have what we call these Elmer Fudd exploratory testing sessions. The Elmer Fudd is because we're hunting bugs, is the kind of the paradigm there. And what we do is we use those as a way to focus on a specific area of the app, often one that was either recently changed or a new feature we're rolling out, and have time for both people who worked on it and people who didn't work on it, who it's new to explore the application and find new cases that we can feed back into that we can not only then ensure are working as expected from a user perspective, but that we can then feed back into our test coverage and test cases that we add. And at the same time, we do the same thing with customer feedback sessions. And then the next step is, once we release to production, you want to know, are users using it, getting the experience they expected? Are they hitting bugs, or even if they're not hitting bugs, are there aspects of the feature we released that are confusing or not behaving necessarily as people are trying to use them? And we have a number of tools that then feedback from there, which are various types of application instrumentation, telling us where people are clicking, where they're getting stuck, where there seems to be frustration. And then also support requests are a great source of data for this as well, right? So where are we getting a lot of questions? Even if the questions aren't leading to bugs, are we finding out that lots of people are confused and asking questions about a particular feature, and that's maybe a sign that there's some practical coverage we need to add in that area and need to rethink. Finally, I guess I just call out coverage isn't really a static. We don't think of coverage as a static thing. A lot of the metrics are static in terms of lines and branches covered. But when you think about am I testing the things that my users expect, that's something you're constantly learning about, just as you're constantly learning about the product. And with that, I'll pass off to Adeeb, who's going to take us through the Sensomatic story around coverage.
All right, thanks, Geoff. Thanks, Katie. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Before we jump right into Sensomatic's approach to test coverage, I wanted to take a couple minutes to just let the audience understand what Sensomatic is all about. Sensomatic solution helps retailers drive frictionless, personalized experiences by powering accurate decision-making across the enterprise. We do this by leveraging our 4 main pillars, which are inventory intelligence, loss prevention, traffic, and analytics. TrueView's inventory intelligence harnesses the power of RFID for a single view of item level inventory across your enterprise. Sensomatic empowers retailers to fight global shrink and retail crime with proven merchandise protection solutions. On the traffic side, big data in retail is being used to shape the customer experience by making shopping easier, more convenient, and more interesting. Sensomatic's ShopperTrack solution collects and delivers data that retailers can easily convert into meaningful and actionable insights. Last but not the least, on the analytics side, we help retailers harness that data across the entire retail enterprise to deliver exceptional shopper experiences and increase operational excellence. So you'll notice we have a ton of products, ton of way our customers use our data and use our services, which brings us to quality to its core. We want to make sure we deliver optimum quality and an exceptional customer service, which is why test coverage makes a huge difference to us. Let's jump right into what my approach is in terms of test coverage. Creating a comprehensive testing strategy, it should take into account the application's requirement as well as testing methods you will be employing. Moving on, creating a checklist of all those testing activities. Based on the strategy, next step will be to create a list of actual tasks that needs to be carried out. Now, keep in mind, you need to account for manual and automated, size and experience of your team, and the type of application you are developing. You also need to prioritize areas of application. Favor areas of application that are critical and have a high probability of having problems. You then need to create a list of all those applications, perform a risk analysis, which would be helpful in your risk coverage. And last but not the least, you have to leverage your test automation. That way you'll reduce overall testing time, free professionals from doing repetitive and tedious error-prone activities, and be able to cover more portion of that application. Keeping this strategy in mind, at least in Sensomatic, we saw a huge difference before and after. I'll take you to a couple examples for two of our products. Both are web reporting products. And for this webinar, I'm going to take you to these two applications. So for product one, when we started, we were only at 40% test automation coverage. We were not able to do any PDF testing, no email testing. API testing was barely minimum to zero. When we started our journey, I'm proud to say that we have almost double our automation coverage. Not only doubling our automation coverage to 80%, but we were able to add more and more comprehensive scenarios, data validations. We were able to cover emails and PDFs and CSVs, and more test cases were migrated to the Mabel platform. For the other product, we went from a staggering 10% to an exceptional 95% automation coverage. And as and when more features come in, we try to be as close to 100% as possible. This has helped us tremendously achieve so many goals, not to mention happy customer. But you might ask, how did we get there? There were a couple of things we utilized to get there. We utilize the click and record functionality Mabel gives us. We utilize the API testing functionality. We use the Mabel extract JS snippet for more and more data validation. And then we parameterize flows to make our flows a lot more universal and reusable in most of our scenarios. We incorporated our automation first approach and our initiative to utilize the echo feature in the trainer to write our manual test scripts directly in Mabel so we can automate. Last but not the least, I do want to highlight the amazing work my team has done. So the two products which I just showed you, for the first one where we went from 10% to 80%, I just want to talk about a little bit about the team dynamics. We had around 9 QAs, around 13 developers, and over 6,000 test cases. And the product where we went from 10% to 95%, it was around 3 QAs, 5 dedicated devs, and roughly around 1,000 test cases. So you can understand the complexity and the amount of test cases my team was able to deliver. Super happy about that. In addition to that, Mabel keeps on bringing out new features, and I just want to highlight a few features I'm really excited about, and my team can vouch for it. First and foremost, mobile testing. Really excited about what Mabel can bring to the table in terms of mobile testing. The use of configure find has improved our element reliability tremendously, and we look forward to making our test stable and reduce maintenance time. We want to add more and more scenarios using JS snippet and use API test. Using all of those features, obviously, our goal is to increase automation coverage. All of this had a huge impact on our business. There are some numbers I'm showing on the dashboard right now. Because of this automation coverage, we were able to reduce our production bugs to a 35% year over year. In addition to that, our pass percent increased to 95%. What that means is 95% of the time, whatever we deployed in production stayed in production. And then 90% punctual delivery of all of our initiatives, because we were able to run our regression cycles and our testing cycles and utilize more and more of our automation. Considering all of these metrics, obviously we had great feedback from our customers. Our customers were happy. And in addition to our customers being happy, our team was also very bonded. We had great synergy amongst ourselves. People were helping each other, and a happy team. So happy customer, happy team were the greatest takeaways I had from this exercise. To conclude, my advice on improving test automation coverage to whoever's watching today, I'll start by laying out 5 bullet points, starting with having a strong strategy which allows the team to give a good roadmap for effective testing. That will keep them grounded, especially in high stress release cycles. Data collection is necessary practice for high quality QA and QE teams, and knowing their key KPIs, internal and industry benchmarks, most important customer happiness and sentiments can ensure your team is focused on testing the most important part of your applications and provide a path for improving overall customer experience. Moving on, setting goals assists teams in working towards a productive release that benefits not only the bottom line, but also enhances innovation and collaboration within the team. To be genuinely successful, expanding test coverage must be done gradually and in stages. You cannot flip the switch in a day or two. You have to have proper planning and have gradual milestones and timelines. Last but not the least, test automation coverage can be test automation can be a huge multiplier when it comes to coverage. When it comes to enabling your test at runtime, you want to make sure you have less human intervention, allowing your QA teams to use more and more of their time to be creative and focus their efforts on testing more complicated scenarios or participate in more exploratory testing. So these are kind of the high level bullet points that I would lay down to whoever wants to kind of start going towards the test automation coverage increasement plan. Thank you guys for giving me this opportunity, and we'll take questions now.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Adeeb, and thank you, Geoff. That's some great information in that all of those slides and throughout the session today. We did have a couple of questions that have come in. Adeeb, let's start with you. A question that came in was around, you just talked about actionable data. So could you share a little bit more detail around what you and your team consider actionable data and what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have created data-driven teams within Sensomatic. And what do we mean by data-driven team is that we look at our data and learn from our mistakes and plan for our future and be better every single sprint, every single release. The data we capture is around production bugs. How many bugs are being missed in production? What's their severity? What's their what areas are being missed on. That's number one. Number two is our automation coverage and how well we are progressing towards automation. Are we adding more and more feature sets into automation? That's number two. Number three is obviously production deployment versus rollback. So that's the change failure rate. How many times you deploy certain things in production that stays in production. That's one of the metrics I mentioned on the presentation, where 95% of the time whatever we deploy in production stays in production. Other actionable data we track and act on is delivery timeliness. How punctual are we with our deliveries? If we are punctual, perfect. If we are late, we also capture data around why we are late. Let's understand if there's problems in our requirement gatherings, if there's problem in our estimation, is there a problem in testing and development. So bunch of this gets clubbed into our tools, which enables us to create these actionable insights, and this gives my team the ability to also just reflect and see how well they're doing and where we need to improve on, and rightfully so, get the credit back to the team, right? Reducing production bugs year over year by 35%, improving our automation coverage, and having punctual deliveries of our initiatives or projects, speaks volume, speaks that the team is going in the right direction. Obviously, everyone has to improve, and everyone can be better. But these are some of the data points we measure to make sure we're going in the right direction.
That's great. Adeeb, I have another question for you, actually. This question is, how are you creating and managing your testing tasks? Are you using a specific tool?
Yes, we use Atlassian products. Yes, we use X-Ray. We have a common strategy. One of the points I mentioned, even in test automation, which goes literally in any exercise you do, is having a common strategy. So my team, any project, any initiative, high, medium, low, complex, simple projects, we have a set of testing activities we do. We have functional, non-functional, we have regression testing, and everything is automated. We have an automation first approach. So the team, it's expected, and we have alignment with the business that we will automate as we go. And we have to cover all of these scenarios. And it's basically a checklist. You do this, you do this, you do this. And once everything is checked, we move on to the next level. So we utilize some tools, but also a good strategy across what type of testing we have to do, what environments do we have to use, and so on and so forth. Definitely helps my team stay on put and follow that common objective.